It was one of those mornings when Oxford seemed less a city than a state of mind, half shrouded, half remembered, the air pale with a mist that softened even the quarrelsome chimneys. I had taken myself to the Broad for no other reason than that the day demanded delay. The bells at St. Mary's tolled without urgency, their echoes stumbling along the High, and I found myself listening as though each note contained a coded message for which I lacked the key. There is a curious consolation in walking aimlessly through a place so thick with memory. The stone retains centuries of argument, the grass in the quads drinks the secrets of 100 unrecorded conversations, and the libraries hoard more sins than absolutions. I paused at Balliol and watched a porter polishing brass with a devotion that seemed almost sacerdotal. He nodded toward me, politely incurious. I envied him. I was, as ever, inadequately armoured against the aftermath of the previous evening's whisky. The crossword in my pocket resisted completion. I had stared at it in the King's Arms the night before, the ink slightly blurred, the answers dissolving into evasive blanks. Only one clue had arrested me. Death's long corridor, 5. I wrote it down, erased it, and wrote again. I left the page with a smudge that betrayed indecision rather than solution. As I stood by the Sheldonian railings, I thought of a line of poetry, something about footsteps trailing through cloisters, though I could not have sworn to the author. My memory is as faithless as my liver, but the mood was there, persistent, spectral. Oxford is a place where one feels watched, not always by the living. Lewis would have said I was brooding, and he would have been right. He would also have said there was no sense in wandering about when reports awaited my attention, but it was in such aimlessness that my mind sometimes unclenched. I watched students cross the quad, some late for tutorials, some drifting with the idle purpose of youth, and I envied them too, not for their freedom, but for their ignorance of endings. It was then, as I leaned against the cold rail, that I noticed a figure at the corner of Cat Street. He stood for longer than made sense, studying a notice board with an intentness bordering on obsession. When at last he moved away, I wandered across and found myself staring at the same sheet of paper, a lecture timetable, no more, yet one slot had been heavily underlined in pencil. Dr. Adrian Latimer, Wednesday, 11 a.m. The pencil line was rough, pressed too deep, tearing the edge of the paper. I wondered idly who cared enough to deface a timetable. The name meant little to me then. A drizzle began, fine as muslin. I turned into the Bodleian quadrangle, letting the rain stipple my coat. Somewhere a door creaked open and shut again. I was reminded, absurdly, of the line from Virgil I once misquoted in an examination. The door of death stands open night and day. Such mistakes cling to one's mind, though they rarely matter to anyone else. In Duke Humphrey's library, the scent of vellum and dust enveloped me like a relic of permanence. I drifted past the chained books, past students whispering with heads bent together, and came upon a volume set askew. Someone had returned it hastily, or perhaps not at all. The Persian's Aeschylus struck me as oddly familiar. I opened it at random. A marginal note in an impatient hand corrected a mistranslation. The words "death comes not by chance" had been underlined. It was none of my business, and yet, perversely, it already was. I closed the book, returned to my crossword, and tried the clue again. Death's long corridor, perhaps a tomb, perhaps grave, 5 letters, each inadequate. I let it be. The porter's bell rang somewhere below, summoning no one in particular. Oxford continued about its elaborate charade of continuity, and I continued about mine. I could not have known then that the names scribbled on the notice board, the underlined lecture, and the misplaced book were already conspiring to call me back into the familiar business of endings. But I felt it in the marrow of the morning, that slight tremor of significance one never quite ignores. It was as though the city itself had whispered my name. It was Lewis who insisted we should call at St. Swithin's that afternoon, though I suspect his motives were practical, while mine were little more than curiosity disguised as duty. The rain had thickened by the time we reached the college, beads of water glistening like old varnish on the mullioned windows, and I remember thinking that Oxford never looked more itself than when drenched. The porter let us through with a kind of solemn discretion that can only be cultivated by years of watching scholars grow prematurely grey. We crossed the quad in silence, the lawn unnaturally bright against the stone. Somewhere above us, a sash window clattered shut, hurried, secretive. The senior common room carried the smell of polished oak and dry sherry. A fire burned lazily, insufficient against the damp. Several fellows had gathered, the loose circle of men and women who seemed perpetually suspended between conversation and calculation. Their voices lowered a fraction as we entered, not so much wary as reflexively guarded. Lewis, a good man, introduced our presence with his plain candour. I chose instead to observe. A newspaper lay abandoned on a side table, folded neatly to reveal the headline, "University Don Found Dead in Rooms." The article was sparse, clinical, naming him as Dr. Adrian Latimer, Fellow in Classics, his death attributed without ceremony to natural causes. I remarked casually that Oxford had a way of writing its own obituaries before anyone else could. A thin fellow with wire spectacles responded that Latimer had been a controversial figure, a brilliant man, but difficult. He misquoted a line from Sophocles as if to prove his scholarship, and I knew at once he had never read it properly. It is remarkable how one can betray oneself with a single borrowed phrase. Another voice, Professor Harcourt, I later learned, spoke with austere brevity. Latimer had enemies, but then so does anyone who prefers truth to tact. Her tone was clipped, though I thought I saw a tremor at the corner of her mouth when his name was repeated. Lewis asked the routine questions when Latimer had last been seen, who had keys to his rooms, whether he had been unwell. The answers were vague, the kind that implied either ignorance or discretion. I suspected the latter. I let my gaze wander to the shelves along the far wall. Books, orderly at first glance, but one or two pushed back further than the others, as though recently returned in haste. A small thing, easily ignored, yet such details have a way of tugging at one's mind later. In the course of that muted gathering, a student waiter entered with a tray of sherry. He lingered longer than was necessary, his eyes darting not toward us, but toward a particular fellow Vale, if memory serves, who shifted in his chair with a nervous precision. The boy's look was not of admiration, but of something heavier, half fear, half resentment. I stored it away. The conversation faltered into the weather, into examinations, into the petty scaffolding of academic life. Yet beneath it all lay the distinct impression of relief, as if Latimer's absence had eased some private burden. The silence that followed his name was not the silence of mourning, but of recalculation. When we stepped back into the quad, Lewis muttered that they were a cagey lot. I replied that cages, however elegant, are still built to contain something. As we walked away, the bells tolled again, indifferent, and the rain pressed harder against the stone. I thought of the crossword clue once more, Death's Long Corridor, and wondered whether I had already set foot upon it without quite knowing where it led. We returned to St. Swithin's the next morning, when the mist still clung obstinately to the stone, and the air carried that faint metallic tang of damp leaves beginning to rot in the gutters. Oxford has a talent for appearing timeless, yet in that hour it felt airless, as if nothing inside those walls had moved for centuries. The porter unlocked the heavy oak door with a ceremony that suggested we were intruding upon a sanctum rather than conducting a police inquiry. He muttered something about the college wishing for the whole matter to remain discreet, which was Oxford's way of saying they wanted it forgotten. The hinges groaned, and the cloister revealed itself in slender arches, ivy darkened by rain, echoes of footsteps too long past. Lewis strode ahead with his solid gait while I lingered, as I often do, in the details. The stone slabs beneath us were worn smooth, as though hundreds of years of scholars had paced in the same uneasy circuits. A gardener was clipping ivy at the far corner, his shears rhythmical, his eyes fixed on the ground. I wondered if he had overheard more than he was prepared to admit. Inside the main staircase the air was thick with polish and old paper. The walls bore portraits of forgotten masters, their eyes painted with that mixture of benevolence and quiet menace peculiar to academics. We climbed past doors with brass nameplates, each one guarding its secrets with a silence more eloquent than words. The master of the college received us in his study, a room of restrained grandeur, filled with books in impeccable order. He spoke of Latimer with measured detachment, describing him as an able scholar, not always tactful, perhaps too devoted to principles that others found inconvenient. His words were smooth, but his hands betrayed him the way he rearranged papers already neatly stacked, the flicker of irritation when Lewis pressed for precise times. I asked whether Latimer had lectured that final morning. The master paused a heartbeat too long before replying that yes, he had been seen in the lecture hall, though he could not quite recall who had attended. That hesitation was enough to stir doubt. Oxford prides itself on memory. Here was a man deliberately misplacing it. We walked afterward through the narrow passages that stitched the college together. A student passed us, head bowed, carrying an armful of books. His shoes squeaked faintly on the polished boards, and he glanced back just once with the guilty curiosity of one who knows more than he dares confess. I filed away his face. At Latimer's room, we stood on the threshold. The door, the porter assured us, had been found ajar, though it was usually kept locked. Inside, the air was stale, as though the room had been holding its breath. The desk bore the marks of interrupted work papers shuffled, an uncapped pen, and in the hearth, ashes not yet fully grey. Someone had burned something in haste. Lewis muttered that perhaps it was nothing but old correspondence. Perhaps. But a burnt letter leaves behind fragments, and among the cinders I noticed a half-charred corner where the word appointment remained visible. Appointment with whom? I did not say it aloud, not yet. The silence of the room was broken only by the creak of the floorboards as we moved. Each sound seemed magnified, accusatory. I ran my hand along the back of a chair and felt a tackiness, as if wine had been spilt and imperfectly wiped away. It was a small thing, yet such stains often outlast the occasion that produced them. As we left, the porter locked the door again with a weighty finality. Outside, the cloister seemed narrower than before, the air heavier. Lewis remarked that everyone appeared evasive. I told him evasions were Oxford's native tongue. What mattered were the words that slipped through by accident. The master's hesitation, the student's backward glance, the smudge of wine on a chair. These were not yet conclusions, only flickers, faint signals beneath the stillness of St. Swithin's. But I had the sense even then that Latimer's death was less an ending than the beginning of a slow unravelling of this cloistered world. The college common room that evening was less a gathering place than a stage, each actor rehearsing their lines while pretending to forget them. The lamps glowed with an amber reluctance, and the curtains did little to muffle the sound of rain tapping against the panes. I sat back, content to let the room reveal itself, for silence often achieves what interrogation rarely does. Professor Emily Harcourt was the first to catch my attention. She leaned against the mantel, her figure straight as an exclamation, her eyes fixed on the fire, as if the flames might yield a translation truer than Latin ever allowed. When she spoke of Latimer, it was without ornament. He was gifted, she said, and cruel in the way gifted men sometimes are. The remark was measured, yet the rhythm of her fingers against the mantel betrayed more heat than her voice allowed. It struck me that her grief, if grief it was, had been compressed into something colder, more dangerous. Julian Fawcett drifted near the window, a doctoral student whose expression had that combination of eagerness and disillusion only the young managed to wear convincingly. He muttered to Lewis about supervision meetings, about Latimer's tendency to belittle rather than guide, about promises unkept. His words were barbed but brittle, a performance rehearsed too often. I noticed, however, the faint ink stain on his cuff, the same shade as the blot on Latimer's desk. It could have meant nothing, and yet I noted it as one notes the faintest crossing out in a crossword clue. Dr. Peter Vale arrived late, apologizing with a laugh that convinced no one. His suit was well cut but tired at the seams, his smile stretched just a little too far. He spoke easily of college dinners, of fundraising, of the endless trifles of administration. Only when Latimer's name was mentioned did his glass pause a fraction before reaching his lips. A silence that is precise is seldom accidental. Then there was Catherine Lonsdale, the bursar, who occupied her chair like a woman accustomed to governance. She observed more than she contributed, her eyes restless, measuring. When pressed about Latimer, she offered a practical assessment that he was difficult, but his death created difficulties of a more tangible kind. I asked her if she had seen him last evening. She shook her head too quickly, then steadied herself, adding that she had been working late in her office. I believed the lateness, I doubted the solitude. As the conversation ebbed, I recalled again the crossword folded in my coat pocket. Death's long corridor, 5 letters still unresolved. I had almost written crypt when Fawcett mentioned, half to himself, that Latimer had once accused him of misquoting Horace. His phrasing was off, he said, quote when the more natural word would have been cited. It was a small thing, yet it stirred in me the memory of the master's earlier hesitation, the way the dons seemed to betray themselves in slips of language rather than confession. Words, after all, are their weapons. Misuse reveals more than silence. The fire guttered. Vale excused himself too hurriedly, Harcourt remained with her eyes still in the flames, and Lonsdale rearranged papers no one else had touched. Fawcett, restless, left muttering about deadlines. Lewis looked at me, expectant, but I merely told him that Oxford never lacked for clever suspects. He said they all seemed shifty to him. I replied that shifty was easy. What mattered was the hesitation, the pause, the detail that could not quite be rehearsed. When we stepped back into the rain-soaked quad, the stones gleamed like wet slate, and I could not escape the feeling that the college itself was a suspect, its walls colluding, its silence a kind of complicity. The shadows lengthened, and I carried with me not answers, but impressions. A glass held too long, a word chosen wrongly, a denial too swift. It was enough for now, enough to begin. The morning after my visit to the common room, I found myself once again in Latimer's quarters. Rain lingered in the air, making the curtains heavy with damp, and the faint odour of extinguished smoke still clung to the hearth. Lewis busied himself with the practicalities, measuring, asking the porter for keys, jotting notes in his straightforward script. I allowed myself to sit at Latimer's desk, not as an intruder, but as one attempting to understand the pattern of a mind now silenced. On the desk lay a heap of papers, lecture notes in a precise but hurried hand, fragments of translation, and at the edge, folded neatly as though saved for later, a crossword from the Times. It was half completed, the black squares filled with a hand both impatient and arrogant. I recognized the trait. Scholars often solved puzzles as though they were lecturing an audience rather than conversing with a clue. The clue that arrested me was the one I had puzzled over days before. Death's long corridor, 5. Latimer had written a crypt, then crossed it out, then written a tomb. Neither quite fitted, though each was defensible. What struck me was the untidiness. Latimer had been exact in all else, but here he left ambiguity scrawled across the page. Perhaps he had been interrupted. Perhaps he had intended it as something more, a message half-formed, left in the careless haste of someone who knew he might not finish. Lewis asked if I believed it meant anything. I told him that a crossword is seldom only about words. It is about misdirection, about seeing what is not said. He frowned and went back to his notes. There was another detail, a small wine stain on the edge of the crossword, the same dark trace I had seen upon the armchair the day before. It told me that the crossword had been consulted not in solitude, but in company, with glasses raised and arguments made. Someone else had been here, leaning close enough to spill, careless enough to leave the mark of presence. I ran my fingers across the blot of ink at the corner of the page. The pattern of hesitation was unmistakable. Latimer had paused mid-answer. Why? The clue itself was almost too easy for him. He could quote entire passages of Aeschylus without faltering, yet here he had stumbled. I began to wonder if the puzzle was not in the newspaper but in his life, and that he had seen in the clue a reflection too sharp to ignore. The room yielded little else, yet I felt its silence pressing. A chair angled not toward the desk but toward the door, as though awaiting a visitor. A matchbook left upon the windowsill bearing the name of a wine bar near Jericho. Lewis remarked that such things were commonplace. I said nothing, but I pocketed it. It is in the commonplace that the unusual hides most easily. As we left, I found myself glancing back at the desk, at the crossword, with its half-written answers and stains of wine. A trivial thing, one might argue. Yet my instinct told me that in that page lay the beginnings of understanding, a fragment of truth, smudged and crossed out but not erased. Oxford, with its cloisters and libraries, prides itself on completion. Arguments concluded, essays marked, books catalogued. But it was the incompleteness of that crossword that lingered with me. The absence of resolution, the hesitation caught in ink. I carried it away in my mind, not as evidence, but as a whisper, faint and unfinished, demanding patience. It was inevitable that suspicion should turn first toward the student. Youth is an easy scapegoat, particularly when temper and pride leave their marks so clumsily. Julian Fawcett had never mastered the art of discretion, and in a place like St. Swithin's, indiscretion is both currency and noose. Lewis was convinced we had our man. He showed me a diary entry recovered from Fawcett's lodgings, where the words vengeance and justice bled through in adolescent capitals. He showed me, too, the testimony of a porter who had overheard raised voices in Latimer's rooms only days before. And then, as if the case required no further embroidery, there was the wine glass in Latimer's study bearing Fawcett's prints. It looked conclusive, absurdly so. Lewis said it was clear enough. A quarrel, a temper lost, a shove or a blow. I nodded, though inwardly the neatness troubled me. Crimes are rarely so obliging. They prefer the oblique, the misdirected, the faintly absurd detail overlooked. I watched Fawcett in the cloister that afternoon. He walked with shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed somewhere inward. When I asked about Latimer, his words tumbled out, sharp and bitter. Latimer had belittled his thesis, undermined him before the faculty, dismissed years of work with a sneer. He admitted the quarrel freely. He admitted, too, that he had sworn never to forgive. Yet, as he spoke, I noticed his shoes crusted thick around the soles. Latimer had died on a night of unrelenting rain. The quad had been slick with water, but the paths were paved. For such mud to cling, he must have been elsewhere, beyond the ordered bounds of college stone. I pressed him lightly on where he had been. He hesitated, then muttered something about a walk to Port Meadow, about needing air. It sounded implausible, yet the mud confirmed at least part of it. His lie was not about the place, but about the reason. That difference struck me. Guilt speaks in overcompensation, innocence in misdirection. Later in the master's study, Lewis presented the evidence with the quiet satisfaction of a man nearing conclusion. The master inclined his head gravely and murmured that justice must be done. His words were slow, almost rehearsed, as though he had foreseen this outcome and prepared himself for it. That certainty unsettled me more than Fawcett's protestations ever could. Back in my room, I unfolded the crossword again. The clue stared back at me. Death's long corridor, Bomb 5. Fawcett had written tomb in his own crossword that same day, a trivial fact I discovered when Lewis thrust his exercise books at me, eager for corroboration. Yet his letters were neat, complete, finished. Latimer's were scratched out, restless, indecisive. It was not the answer that mattered, but the hesitation. Fawcett had no hesitation. That night I drank whiskey by the window, watching the lamps smudge in the rain. Lewis believed the case was closed. Fawcett had motive, opportunity, and a printed trail of rage. But the evidence arranged itself too neatly, as though placed deliberately in a row for us to follow. Real life is untidy, I reminded myself. It spills and stains like the wine on Latimer's armchair. Somewhere between the half-finished crossword and the mud on Fawcett's shoes, I felt the first tremor of doubt become certainty. We had been led, gently but firmly, toward the obvious. And the obvious, in Oxford, is always a mask. I had thought the business with Fawcett too convenient, too theatrical, and so my attention turned toward Professor Harcourt. She had carried herself in the common room with that cool detachment academics cultivate when they fear sentiment might be mistaken for weakness. Yet I knew that detachment often concealed something warmer once, something wounded. Her rooms overlooked the back quad, where ivy clawed at the stone, and the air smelled faintly of mould and chalk dust. She received me with a composure bordering on severity, and when I asked about Latimer, she replied that he had been a man of rare intellect and rarer kindness, though kindness, in her view, was not his most consistent virtue. The phrasing was deliberate, the tone rehearsed. Lewis pressed her about the letter found in Latimer's desk, the one signed only with an initial. E. She did not flinch, though her hand, resting on the arm of her chair, curled inwards at the mention. She admitted to correspondence, yes, though only of scholarly matters. Translation disputes, discussions of metre. I said lightly that the words betrayed more than scholarship. She looked at me then with something sharper than irritation, but she said nothing further. The letter itself had puzzled me from the beginning. Its diction was strangely uneven, a phrase borrowed from Milton set against a Latin idiom too colloquial for Harcourt's usual rigour. It was not her voice, or not entirely. That misfit of tone nagged at me, as a crossword clue misread nags until corrected. The writer had tried to sound like her, but mimicry always falters in rhythm. Lewis, ever practical, remarked afterwards that she had motive enough rivalry, wounded pride, perhaps even a rejection. I could not dismiss it, and yet I felt the weight of misdirection pressing again. If she had killed him, she would not have needed to misquote Milton. That error belonged to someone else. As we left her rooms, the corridor creaked beneath us, and the silence seemed to stretch further than stone allowed. A door at the end stood ajar, though no one appeared within. I wondered how many ears had followed our conversation. Oxford walls are rarely deaf. Later, alone in my room, I unfolded the crossword once more. That same unfinished clue, death's long corridors stared back at me, the letters half scribbled, the ink blotched by hesitation. Harcourt, I knew, would never have left it incomplete. She would have solved it, precisely, pedantically. That detail alone exonerated her in my mind, though I could hardly prove it. The city outside was quiet, the rain easing to a drizzle that dampened the cobblestones. I poured whiskey and let the case circle endlessly in thought. Fawcett too obvious, Harcourt too precise. Each suspect a figure painted with shadows, and yet none emerging clearly enough. Lewis asked, as he always did, whether we were any closer. I told him we had reached another dead end. He sighed, resigned, and said at least we were narrowing the field. But I was not so sure. Oxford has a way of widening the labyrinth the deeper one enters. Each door opened onto another corridor, each suspect led back to silence. And still the crossword lay unfinished, waiting for the answer neither Latimer nor I had yet found. It was in the archives that I first felt the weight of Latimer's past pressing against the present. The room smelled of parchment and dust, as though centuries had been carefully catalogued but never quite laid to rest. Rain ticked faintly against the high windows, a sound as steady as a metronome. Lewis, impatient, shuffled beside me while I leafed through a folder of old photographs, the kind the university produces for anniversaries and jubilees. The images were stiff with formality, rows of fellows in their gowns, faces blurred by time, yet preserved in that peculiar Oxford manner, half proud, half wary. It was one such photograph that arrested me at a gathering at Rhodes House 20 years earlier. There, among the smiling figures, stood Latimer, his expression as severe then as in death. Beside him was Peter Vale, younger, unlined, his posture too deferential for comfort. I traced the outline of their proximity with my finger. The archivist looked at me with mild disapproval, as if I had trespassed on something sacred. I murmured an apology and returned the photograph, but the image had already lodged in memory. Vale had not spoken of this connection, not even hinted at it. Concealment, in my experience, is rarely innocent. Lewis asked what it proved. I told him nothing, yet everything. He shook his head, muttering that I was seeing ghosts. Perhaps I was. But ghosts in Oxford often walk in daylight, visible to anyone willing to look. Later, in Vale's rooms, I let the silence do most of the asking. He laughed too freely, poured wine too quickly, and when I mentioned Rhodes House, his glass paused just short of his lips. He recovered with a story about scholarships and ceremonies, about Latimer's role as mentor. But his words were too polished, his tone brittle. He spoke of debt, of gratitude, yet his eyes slid toward the window as though unwilling to meet mine. Gratitude, I have found, is a word used when the opposite is intended. That night I revisited Latimer's papers. Among them, tucked between lecture notes, was a scrap of correspondence in Vale's hand. The ink had faded, but the plea was a clear request for funds, couched in scholarly terms, almost abject in its formality. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. I remembered the way Vale's hand shook slightly when he refilled his glass. Lewis said it was hardly unusual for dons to lend or borrow, but the tone of that letter was one of dependence, even of desperation. and desperation, as I have often observed, is fertile ground for resentment. I folded the letter back into its place and returned to the crossword on Latimer's desk. Death's long corridor, 5 letters unresolved. That night the answer that pressed itself upon me was Hades, and though I did not yet write it down, I felt its weight settle into me. Latimer had known something of descent, of corridors without return. Perhaps Vale had been dragged into that descent with him. The quad outside was silvered by the moon when we left the archives. The stones gleamed wet, and the arches cast shadows longer than the eye could measure. Lewis walked beside me in silence. I thought again of the photograph, of the young Vale beside Latimer, their faces turned toward the camera with a closeness that had since been erased. The past intruded, uninvited, and refused to leave. In Oxford, nothing ever really disappears. It waits, folded between pages, pressed beneath varnish, preserved in the expressions of those who would rather forget. And it was the past, not the present, that whispered most insistently that night. It was late when I found myself alone in a corner of the pub, a half-empty glass of whiskey before me, and the crossword spread on the table like a stubborn adversary. The place had emptied, save for the hum of a cleaner somewhere in the back, her movements as steady as the ticking clock above the bar. The city beyond the window was blurred by drizzle, lamps glowing faintly, as though reluctant to illuminate what remained of the night. I unfolded my notebook, glanced idly at the statements we had gathered, and felt the weight of their sameness pressing on me. Too neat, too rehearsed. It was the sort of uniformity that suggested not truth, but collusion. I took a long sip, let the silence settle, and began reading each note again, slower this time, as if the cadence itself might betray what fact refused to yield. It was the master's words that caught me. I had not noticed it then, in the polite gloom of his study, but he had spoken of Latimer's last lecture, and, in passing, quoted Aeschylus. The phrase had sounded oddly familiar, but I had dismissed it as the affectation of a man steeped in the classics. Now, with the whiskey softening the edges of memory, I recalled the precise words, "Death comes not by chance." They were the very words I had seen underlined in the library copy of the Persians. I considered the improbability of coincidence. The master had spoken as though from memory, yet I doubted he had read the play recently. His interests lay elsewhere, in college accounts and ceremonial duties, unless, of course, he had come across the phrase more recently in Latimer's own hand, in papers not meant for him. The thought tightened in my chest with the inevitability of a deduction one wishes were not true. Lewis would have called it flimsy. He would have urged me not to hang suspicion on a misquoted fragment. And yet in Oxford, words are never accidental. Misquotation is confession. I ran my fingers over the crossword again, Death's long corridor, 5 letters unresolved, and felt the echo of that same intrusion. A clue altered, a phrase borrowed, a hesitation forced into silence. The small, stubborn detail that shifted the balance of the whole. I left the pub with the crossword folded carefully in my coat. The air outside was sharp with rain, the cobbles shining with reflections of lamps that seemed to multiply without end. The walk back through the narrow lanes was solitary, yet I felt accompanied by the whisper of that phrase, circling, insistent. Death comes not by chance. In my room, the fire had burned to embers. I poured the last of the whiskey, sat at the desk, and laid out the scraps of evidence like fragments of a jigsaw. Mud on Fawcett's shoes, Harcourt's impeccable precision, Vale's silences, Lonsdale's evasions. Each had their place, but it was the master who now loomed at the edges, his polished courtesy masking a hesitation too precise. I could not yet prove it, nor even articulate it fully. But I knew. It was not in the grand gestures or the quarrels or the letters half burned in the grate. It was in the overlooked detail, the borrowed words, the faintest smudge of presence where there should have been none. That was always where truth lay, waiting in shadows. I sat for a long time without moving, the crossword before me, the pencil hovering over the squares. Hades was the answer, but I did not yet write it down. Some corridors, I thought, one does not enter until there is no other choice. The night was windless, the air holding that peculiar Oxford stillness which makes even whispers feel intrusive. I walked through the cloisters with Lewis at my side, his pace brisk, mine slowed by the weight of what had gathered in my mind. The stones were slick from rain, reflecting fragments of lantern light, and the arches cast shadows longer than they had any right to be. It was not the first time truth had chosen to arrive in such a place, secluded, indifferent, eternal. The master came toward us, robed still, as though the trappings of office could shelter him from what waited. He spoke of the college's sorrow, of the inevitable scandal, of the wish that justice might be both swift and quiet. His words, courteous, failed to conceal the tightening of his jaw, the quickening of his breath. I listened not to the speech, but to the cadences beneath it. I told him, almost gently, that Latimer's papers had been touched after his death. He frowned, protested, and asked how such a thing could be known. I said it was a matter of phrasing. Aeschylus had been misquoted in his study, and the very same words had found their way into the master's mouth. He smiled at that thinly, insisting it was a coincidence. But coincidence, in Oxford, is always overruled by context. Lewis shifted beside me, restless, uncertain. He wanted certainty, the kind that could be filed and signed. I gave him instead the fragments the crossword clue altered, the hesitation too deliberate, the fire that had burned not idle correspondence but an accusation. Latimer had found something in the accounts, I suggested, something that did not balance. Appointment, the word preserved in ash, was not with a student or a colleague. It was with the master. For a moment, silence pressed between us. Then the master's voice dropped into something closer to weariness than defiance. He said that Latimer had been relentless, that he would have destroyed not only a career, but the dignity of the college itself. A blow, struck in desperation, had silenced him. Afterwards, the careful rearranging of papers, the altering of a crossword, the use of a phrase meant to appear careless. But even rehearsed words cannot conceal hesitation. I asked him whether dignity was worth more than a man's life. He said nothing, only turned his gaze toward the quad, where the grass glistened faintly under the lanterns. It was enough, Lewis signalled to the constables waiting beyond the gate. They stepped forward quietly, as though mindful of the centuries watching. The master did not resist. He walked with them, as one accustomed to procession, his head bowed only slightly, as though in thought rather than shame. When they had gone, the cloisters seemed emptier than before, the arches rising like questions with no answers. Lewis muttered that it was always the ones who looked least likely. I replied that likelihood had nothing to do with it. What condemned him was not anger, nor even motive, but a single misused word. It is in such minor details that the world reveals its fractures. I lingered there long after Lewis had gone, the cold of the stone seeping through my coat, the silence deeper than the hour. I took out the crossword once more, pencil in hand. Death's long corridor. This time I wrote it without hesitation. Hades. The answer had been waiting all along, etched into the margins of the city itself. The bells struck midnight. Their echoes wandered through the cloisters, indifferent, unchanging. Oxford, as ever, carried on, holding its secrets close. while I walked away with another solved, though not mended, not ever mended. The morning after the arrest carried with it a strange quiet, the kind that seems less like calm than exhaustion. St. Swithin's quad was hushed, the grass damp with a thin frost, and the porter raised his cap with a solemnity that suggested both relief and unease. Oxford, in its peculiar way, had already begun folding the scandal into routine, as though centuries of precedent demanded the swift domestication of even murder. Lewis walked beside me with a weariness of his own. He said little, save that the case had ended more cleanly than most. I told him the endings were never clean, though he only shrugged, half amused, half resigned. He is a man who prefers straight lines. I have lived long enough to see them blur. I found myself later in the college garden, where Professor Harcourt stood alone beneath a yew tree, her coat buttoned to the throat. She greeted me with a calm that carried something beneath its gratitude, perhaps, or a muted sadness. She said that Latimer had been many things to many people, and to her he had been both rival and companion, though never quite either. I told her that the truth about people rarely fits into neat categories. She smiled faintly, then turned her eyes toward the frost-laced hedges. For a moment we stood without speaking, the air brittle, the silence more eloquent than words. There was, I thought, a kinship in her solitude, though it was not one that permitted intimacy. Oxford is full of such women, intelligent, self-contained, unreachable women. I felt the familiar ache of wanting what could not be held, of seeing in another a reflection of my own solitary restlessness. Yet I said nothing, only remarked that the garden was beautiful in winter. She replied that beauty, like grief, is often sharper in the cold. When she left, I remained. A robin flitted across the lawn, pausing upon the sundial where time itself seemed paused. I recalled the crossword once more, its clue resolved now but not forgotten. Death's long corridor had yielded its answer, and yet the answer gave me little comfort. Words, once solved, seldom do. Lewis returned in the afternoon with paperwork, his voice steady as he listed the formalities, charges, statements, dates for proceedings. I listened half-heartedly, my mind drifting back to the master's face as he had walked away in custody, dignified even in disgrace, a man undone not by passion, but by calculation. It is a quieter kind of tragedy, and perhaps the crueler for that. I poured whiskey as evening fell, the glass warming slowly in my hand. Through the window the spire of St. Mary's cut the dim sky, its bells preparing to mark another hour. Oxford carried on, unchanged, its streets wet with the day's rain, its scholars already bending back toward books and lectures. A city of continuity, swallowing disruption whole, leaving only the faintest trace in memory. And I, too, carried on. Yet the conversation in the garden lingered, Harcourt's words folded somewhere beneath thought, her presence refusing to recede. I wondered, not for the first time, whether it was possible to desire connection without destroying it, whether solitude was chosen or simply endured. The whiskey gave no answer. Night came with its usual silence, and the embers in the grate faded. I set down my pencil upon the completed crossword, a small, empty victory. Outside, the city breathed in its slow, inexorable rhythm, indifferent to the longings of one man sitting alone with his glass. Oxford would forget, as it always does, but I would not. The college had returned to its customary silence, the sort that seemed more a performance than a condition of peace. The quads were empty, the windows dark, the ivy dripping faintly with the residue of another long rain. I walked alone beneath the arches, the air sharp with November cold, and felt the case recede from me, even as it refused to let go. Latimer's rooms were sealed, his papers boxed, his name already slipping into anecdote. Students would whisper of him for a term or two, fellows would revise their recollections with a subtlety honed by centuries of practice, and the archives would consign him to a line in a ledger. In Oxford, even death is subject to administration. I carried the crossword with me that evening, folded and creased from too much handling. The clue no longer resisted me. Death's long corridor. I had written it at last, Hades, 5 letters of finality, unambiguous, inevitable. Yet it felt less like an answer than an echo. Latimer had wrestled with it in his final hours, the pencil mark trembling, indecisive. Perhaps he had known more than we gave him credit for. Perhaps he had understood that some clues are not meant to be solved in time. Lewis had spoken earlier with his usual straightforwardness. Justice served, he said, and at least the college could move on. I nodded, though the word justice seemed to me too blunt, too cheerless. What had been served was something else, ordered perhaps, but never equilibrium. The living are rarely balanced by the dead. I thought again of Harcourt, her figure in the garden, her voice pared down to essentials. She had thanked me without saying the word, and in that silence lay an understanding both heavier and lighter than speech. It is a cruel truth that the people who stir us most profoundly are often those who remain out of reach. I poured whiskey in her absence, as I always did, and the glass burned without consolation. The fire dwindled in my rooms, shadows slipping across the spines of books, the air scented faintly with smoke and dust. I listened to the creak of floorboards above, the murmur of pipes, the ordinary sounds of Oxford settling into night. It was then I felt the strangeness of the city eternal, while we who move within it falter, blunder, vanish. On my desk the crossword lay finished, yet I kept staring at that one word, as though by repeating it I might learn something more. Hades, a destination, not an explanation. The clue was resolved, but the meaning was unresolved. The case concluded, yet the ache intact. The bells began their hour, echoing through stone, each strike folding into the next, until the sound was less count than continuity. I thought of Latimer walking through cloisters he would never leave, of the master staring at figures that refused to balance, of all the small hesitations that betray us in the end. Oxford slept, indifferent. I remained awake, a solitary witness to puzzles that promised clarity but delivered only fragments. The whiskey glass was empty, the crossword complete, and still I felt the city whisper around me, reminding me that some corridors lengthen long after the answer is written. And so it ended, not with revelation, but with silence,